Good evening and a very warm welcome to everyone joining us tonight from around the UK and also around the world for this annual Stephen Hawking lecture. My name is Dr. Sean Pert, my pronouns are he, him, and I am the chair of the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists. The RCSLT is the professional body for speech and language therapists in the UK with over 20,000 members, and we support speech and language therapists by providing leadership, setting professional standards, facilitating research and promoting better education and training. Our mission is to enable better lives for people with communication and swallowing needs. Our aspirations are inclusive communication for all, a more diverse, inclusive and representative profession with equitable access to culturally appropriate provision for service users, explicit recognition of health inequalities, social disadvantage, and the profession's role in working to counter these. We champion and value the impact of speech and language therapy. We also value and centre co-production with service users, their carers and families. We seek better funding for resources for the profession with a focus on health staff, well-being, innovation and excellence in research and clinical practice, and a stronger evidence base to support that practice. And we're including telehealth and digital inclusion in those thoughts. We seek properly funded senior and specialist roles, clear career pathways and strong multidisciplinary working. As an organisation that empowers its members, it's therefore absolutely fitting that we should have Steven Bloch with us tonight as an SLT himself talk about the importance of good conversations with people with MND. This aligns completely with our aspirations and aims as an organisation, and why it's such a huge honour to be able to host the Stephen Hawking lecture this evening, delivered by Stephen. We would like to acknowledge the collaboration with the MND Association, and the event is generously supported by the Stephen Hawking Foundation. We will now move on to a pre-recorded message from Sally Light, who is the CEO of the MND Association, and then we'll welcome our guest speaker, Professor Steven Bloch, to give his presentation.
Hello, I'm Sally Light, the Chief Executive of the Motor Neurone Disease Association, and I'm really pleased to be here to introduce the 2022 annual Stephen Hawking MND lecture. This significant event has been running since 2017, and this year I'm delighted that it has been organised as part of a long-standing and productive partnership between the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists and the MND Association. I would also like to extend thanks to the Stephen Hawking Foundation for their kind financial support. The focus of tonight's lecture is good communication, and specifically poses the question, how do we have better conversations? Skillful communication is key to effective healthcare. It applies to every discipline. Skillful communication empowers patients, placing them, rightly, at the centre of their care and the decisions about it. Skillful communication enables practitioners to establish rapport with their patients, and from that, build an understanding of their condition and their needs. Skillful communication, quite simply, ensures the best possible care. This important and thoughtful lecture will be given by Professor Steven Bloch. Professor Bloch is an authority on this subject, as well as an extremely engaging presenter. Tonight, he will outline emergent communication practice and research, and how all professionals can adapt their own communication to work better with people living with motor neurone disease and their families. I'm sure you will find this evening stimulating and useful. Thank you very much for being here and for your interest in motor neurone disease.
Many thanks, Sally, for those really informative words and introduction. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure and delight to introduce Professor Steven Bloch. Over to you, Stephen.
Thank you so much, Sean, and Sally Light too. It really is such a privilege to be here today and to have everyone's attention for the next hour. well, that's my aim anyway, to keep you engaged through and with communication. It's so central to my own research, my own clinical practice, and my own identity. And it really is an honour to have the chance to share with you some ideas and reflections today. I'd like to begin with some formal thank yous. The Stephen Hawking Foundation for supporting this event, the Motor Neurone Disease Association for enabling it to happen, particularly Jen Bedford, who invited me what seems like a very long time ago. The Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists, Sean in particular, for enabling this to take place today and their sponsorship of the event. And also funders, NIHR, British Academy and others who have generously supported my work over the years. But I'd also like to thank everyone living with MND, their families, clinicians and academics who have been kind enough to share their time and expertise with me over many, many years now. I'm not going to name them all individually, but there will be some names popping up throughout the session. And there's one family in particular who kindly agreed to share their own video data with us today. And I'll talk a bit more about that later, but I would really like to dedicate today's presentation to Jo and her family, without whom today's presentation would be even more two-dimensional than it really is. I'm so grateful to you, Jo, and what you did for me as a research participant. I will always be incredibly grateful for. So, on the theme of communication and more specifically interaction, how on earth are we going to have interaction today? I'm going to suggest that we begin with your background. Now, ideally, I'd like everyone to introduce themselves, but unfortunately, that's just not going to be possible. But we do have a poll that you can access. And I'd just like to know what your background is. And if the technical company behind this wonderful presentation today have got their act together, we should now see the option of you selecting your background as best you can. And I apologise if your specific profession or role isn't there, but see what you can do. The options are, I believe, on the right-hand side of your screen. And we'll just wait for those to come up. Now, I can't promise to cater for everyone's tastes today, so you may want to treat this presentation as more of a buffet, but hopefully there'll be something for everyone, and that's where we will be. So I'm going to allow the technical team to show us the, oh, there we go. That's what I wanted to see. So let's see what we've got. We have got 60% speech and language therapists, which is much lower than I expected. That's great. We've got professions allied to, oh, it's moving as well. That's even more exciting. Although slightly worrying that speech therapy has already gone down. So clearly someone's decided this isn't for them. But we've got technologists, we have professions allied to medicine, some academics, social care workers, doctors, nurses. So that's a nice, healthy mix. And it's one that gives me some indication of where we need to pitch today. Wouldn't it be wonderful if I could just change my whole presentation to meet the needs of the exact audience? But I think what this shows us is that we have maybe just over half speech and language therapists, but another 50% of people who aren't speech and language therapists. So today's presentation really does try and meet that interesting mix of people who want the depth, but also I hope will benefit from some of the more general background. So let me just give you a sense of what we're going to be doing today. There are three key areas we're going to explore. What we already know about communication in MND, what makes a conversation good, and developing a better conversations approach to communication in MND. And I want to be clear that this lecture isn't really about professional patient communication in the traditional sense. So how to listen or how to break bad news. Other people do that far more effectively. And I wonder if that might be a theme for a future annual Stephen Hawking lecture, something very specific. But what this is about is understanding with a bit more nuance the issue of communication with people with MND and the role that we all play in making communication and conversation better. And this is something that Sally referred to in her introduction, and I know matters very much to the RCSLT, speaking to Sean earlier, about this sense that communication is one of those things that we all do. And it's a real paradox because most of us are incredibly good at communicating. It's not just that we take it for granted, it is so embedded in the way in which we are and how we organise our world that it sometimes becomes quite difficult to step out of our world to reflect on what communication really is. So it really is about understanding what conversation is and how we might begin to shift our perspective on communication in MND. And I really thought hard about this and figured that the best way to do it was to introduce you to two people for whom we will be referring to throughout this presentation. Now, these aren't their real names, but that's okay. It's Jean, who's a woman with MND, and Ali, who happens to be a family member. Now, I met them when I was collecting observational data for my NIHR fellowship work, and they, like several other couples, were kind, or maybe foolish, enough to let me into their homes and sign some consent forms and agree to be recorded in conversation. And as I said earlier, I think that ethics and consent in research and integrity mean a huge amount. And even though they tick the box, which said, yes, of course you can share our videos and we're happy to let them use them in teaching, I never, ever would have taken that for granted. And today's presentation is an example where I went back to them, as I said to the family, and said, would it be okay if I shared these videos? And they said, yes, of course. So I just want to prepare the family who may well be watching this, that this is you, this is how you were, warts and all, the things you did. And I'm so grateful for that. And I promise you that we're not going to be critical. What we're going to be doing is celebrating many of the wonderful things that we did. So let's have a look at one quick video. We're going to watch a very small, quick clip, and I'm going to ask you a question about it. So watch and listen carefully.
I must find more in the loft. What's missing? What are you looking for? Table. Picture. Box. Box of what? Box of ornaments. No more shit.
Right. So the question I want to ask you now is, how would you rate their conversation? Go with your gut instinct. Was it good, positive? Was it negative or bad? Or maybe you just don't know, and that's absolutely fine. So I'm going to invite you now just to go to the poll, bottom right-hand side of the screen, and just tell me whether you thought it was good, whether it was bad, whether you just don't know. Okay. We have 95% good, 4% don't know, 1% bad. Okay, that is really telling a lot. Thank you so much. I'm going to come back to that later on, but the 94% of you or whomever who said it was good have said something that you feel, that you saw, that you're thinking about in terms of how we understand conversation. And that is incredibly important, so thank you for that. And I just want to come on to a few terms as we move forward. And I think this is really important because even though we often use these words colloquially, they have meaning for us. And speech and language therapists hopefully will be very familiar with this. In fact, I'm always apologising to speech therapists for getting things wrong. Just bear with me on this one. This isn't designed to be the definitive. It's designed to give us some clarification, some working principles. So speech. When we use the term speech, we're referring to the physical production of sound for me. So what I'm doing now is I am speaking. And that's fine. You've got that. I think we're fairly clear on understanding speech as a concept. Then we've got language, which sometimes confuses people, but speech and language therapists are pretty good at explaining the differentiation. Language is all about the words, the symbols and the signs that we use to express and understand ourselves. They could be spoken, they could be written, they could be signed, they could be graphic, whatever. So it's the meaning behind. So I'm happily using language right now. I mean, when you think about it, it's mind-blowing. My brain is working. It's creating meaning. It's coming up with words. And almost instantaneously, I'm able to produce speech in this context. But I could have been writing this down, or I could have been using a sign language to express the same thing. Now, when we put those together, we get communication, the use of language and the other behaviours to express and understand ourselves by any means available. So communication, as we know, is typically led by speech, but it is also accompanied very nicely by gesture, by facial expression. If you can, I think you can probably see my hands just desperate to wiggle around a bit. When I'm on the stage, I mean, I'm a blur. And if you think Sean is distracting me with his amazing colour palette and his gorgeous bow tie, the only way I could ever compete with him is by bouncing around and waving my arms in a very distracting manner. It's a terrible image for a speech therapist, but I can't help but communicate non-verbally. Now, there is the fourth element, and this is the one that I think we need to understand from a more technical perspective. It's conversation. Now, we all have a colloquial understanding of what conversation means, and we all engage in conversation. But do we actually have an understanding of what it means from a more scientific point of view? The way I'm going to describe it today is that it's an organised two-way use of terms and sequences of terms. That's terms that work together to accomplish social actions. And they might be institutional as well as non-institutional. So institutional would mean things that we perhaps do in a purposeful way to achieve a specific objective at work. So not just within an institution like a hospital or a school, but pursuing the activity of a particular profession, for example. So you might be a physiotherapist, a nurse, a doctor, a speech therapist. The work you're doing may be called institutional talk. But of course, we're also engaged in non-institutional talk a lot of the time. Going to a shop, you might be talking to someone, you might be having a good coffee with a family member or friend. We might call that non-institutional. It's still conversation. So what happens in conversation? Well, there are so many things that I really, it was one of those issues that if I put it all up on a slide, it's going to be one of those terrible slides where no one can read it and everyone goes, oh, we shouldn't really have done that one. So I've just kind of given some of the things that I think are important. When we have conversations, we need to start the conversation, which is typically done through greetings. We take turns when we have conversation. This is why today this isn't really a conversation that I'm doing. I'm presenting, although I'm incredibly grateful to Sean again because I've got him in the top left hand of my screen. At least I can get that sense of interactivity. Without Sean here, I would be lost. This would be a broadcast, and I would have no idea whether anybody was listening, whether anyone was understanding anything I'm saying. So that sense of reciprocity is, for me, incredibly important. We ask and answer questions a lot in conversation. We tell news, we share troubles and problems and stories. We give and elicit views and opinions and advice. We agree, we disagree. We argue, we complain, we flirt, we gossip, we tease, we collude. We're going to come back to those really important constructs later. We explain things, we show our understanding. We repair troubles or understanding or hearing when they go wrong. And we close conversations, which isn't always easy. I don't know anyone here who still has telephone conversations particularly with family members, how difficult it is to close a conversation on the telephone. And I was talking to some students the other day who expressed the same thing as me. Talking to my mother, trying to get off the phone is almost impossible because just as I make that move, well, Mum, I didn't realise that was the time and I've really got to go. She just throws in a new topic. Oh, Stephen, let me tell you all about what happened next door. And so it goes on. So working to achieve conversational objectives suddenly becomes something that is interesting, complex, but certainly organised, and things that are available for systematic examination. And all of a sudden, we have a science of conversation. So even though conversation is often equated with small talk or something very local, these things can have huge consequences. In some cases, a matter of life or death. But I'm not the expert here. I'm someone who uses and has been informed by the principles and methods of something called conversation analysis for a long time. And I step into a community of conversation analysts who I feel have been incredibly supportive for me as a speech therapist in how I perceive the world. And I'm not going to go through everyone's name who's ever influenced me, but people like Ray Wilkinson, my PhD supervisor, Suzanne Beek, and a lot of my colleagues at UCL, and then all the wonderful people at Loughborough and internationally, particularly Charles Antaki, who I'll come on to later. And I think it would be remiss of me not to actually recommend a book, because I don't often do this, because I feel it's kind of slightly dodgy to be pushing people's work in this way. But really, if you want to know any more about what I've just said, then read Elizabeth Stokoe's book on Talk, The Science of Conversation. Not only is it a relevant book to anyone who works with communication, it's highly entertaining, it's highly readable, and it is incredibly well written and informed as a piece of science. And Liz, if you can't be bothered to read the book, just Google her and watch all of her amazing presentations online, TED Talks, BBC stuff, Life Scientific. I mean, it is amazing. And I think that there is a huge amount for us, all of us, to learn from the work that Liz and colleagues have been engaged with. So the science of conversation is, in many respects, my grounding. So let's move forward here. We've got this sense of communication. And what do we already know about MND communication? We know that it's important in MND. All of the prior Stephen Hawking lectures, which are all available online, they've all mentioned communication in different ways. Chris McDermott talked about the timing of conversations for enteral feeding, for example. Idris Baker last year talked about listening and end-of-life conversations. And I'm going to focus today on, I guess, a more traditional sense from a speech therapy perspective on communication symptoms and change in MND. But I want to just give that as a backdrop so that we've all got a common understanding before we then move back to conversation, because I think it's this interplay between what we've always known about MND communication, its speech effects, cognition and language, and the exciting avenues that we could be exploring through work on conversation that I think give us a really nice approach for thinking about communication in the future. Right. So what is it that we've got in terms of communication in MND? I'm going to argue that there are 5 elements. There may well be many more, but these are the ones that I think are most salient. We've got speech, we've got language, we've got cognition, we've got the use of other modalities, including augmentative and alternative communication, and we've got communication partners. And it's my belief that these elements and how they're synthesized create what we might call our communication identity and how we perceive communication in MND, the way in which we present ourselves to the world and how we engage with others. So each of these elements matters. There is something to be said about all of them. But I just want to ask one question of everyone here, and it is a hard question. The question is, which element matters the most? Speech, language, cognition, other modalities, communication partners, or do they all matter? If you'd like to go to the poll now, just click on your button and we'll give everyone a second. And hopefully, and I'm very impressed with the technical team, because I don't know they've been asked to do this in this format before, so it clearly shows it works. We're using technology. It's hardly cutting edge these days, but we are certainly driving ourselves forward with a level of interactivity. Look at that. There we go. I love the way it changes. I keep thinking people are changing their minds. It kind of, it's great. Okay, which of the elements matter the most? No one says that speech matters the most. That's really interesting. Language, 1%, other modalities. Communication partners are important, sure. Cognition, 6. All of the above, 74. Of course, this is an incredibly loaded question. You can never get away with this, questionnaire design or on a module, someone teaching how to ask survey questions. Of course, I wanted you to say that they all matter, but none of you are wrong. It's just a sense that what we can't do is we can't separate out one of these elements and think exclusively that that's the thing that's important in MND. And I'd say that for many years, speech was the identity of MND. That was the thing that people focused on and said, that's what we need to address, that's what we need to assess, that's what we need to adapt. But over the past 20 years, I'd say that our frameworks have shifted and our confidence has shifted in how we understand the problem of communication. And that's why this integration of elements becomes, I think, a much more real thing for us. But I'm going to go through each of those very briefly. I don't want to spend too long because I do want to get on to the most interesting part of this talk about conversation. So I'm just going to briefly talk about the challenges. And I wanted to get this out there because I didn't want you to think that we were ignoring the elephant in the room, which is that for people with MND where there is communication change, there can be significant challenges. And it may sound incredibly obvious, but I want to say it anyway. It can impact on identity, healthcare decision-making, autonomy, social participation, control, and relationship intimacy and cohesion. If you are experiencing deterioration in your communicative ability, your speech, but also physical deterioration that accompanies that in MND, all of these things can be affected. Speech, particularly, can deteriorate over a relatively short period of time in MND and between different people in different ways. So there's considerable variability on the impact of communication change in MND. It's not the same for every communication partner. It's highly complex. It's interactive, it's dynamic, it's interpersonal, and it's a behavioural activity. It defies simple solutions. And that moves us on to technology, which I will talk about later. Technology fixes, like AAC, do work. There's absolutely no doubt that people with MND successfully use AAC to support their communication. But AAC in itself can present additional problems. One part of the story, but they're not a proxy for communication. AAC is not the solution to communication deterioration. There are other things that we need to factor on. And in summary, communication is more than the sum of the parts. It's not easy to measure in a valid way. A colleague of mine in Australia, Scott Barnes, and myself wrote a paper a couple of years ago now on the difficulty of measuring communication. And a lot of it it's about the difficulty in conceptualizing communication as one unitary event rather than made up of lots of different elements which we try to bring together under the umbrella of communication. Okay, so as I said, it's important that we do at least pay attention to a few areas. So let's just very quickly go through these. And as I said, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but we will do them anyway. So let's talk motor speech. So what we've got in MND is what we call a dysaspheria, a motor speech disorder, typically mixed of upper and lower motor neurons. There are approximately 5,000 to 6,000 people in the UK with MND at any one time. And about 80% of those people with MND will experience some degree of dysaspheria. That ranges from relatively mild to very severe. Now, 30% of people with MND will present that they will initially develop symptoms of what is known as bulbar MND or progressive bulbar palsy. But many who present with other forms of MND will develop involvement of the bulbar muscles at some stage. So effectively, it's not just the 30% that we're interested in, it's everyone with MND who is potentially at risk of deterioration in communicative ability at some point in their disease process. Now, the bulbar muscles, we call it bulbar MND, are those responsible for tongue, pharynx, the larynx, the physical structures that are incredibly important for speech, for swallowing, for breathing too. But there is a lot of variability in how people present and how people compensate behaviourally. So it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that because we've got a handle on the pathology of MND, that somehow we can equate that with correlates of speech deterioration. There is huge variability, and there are all sorts of reasons for that. So we know that it impacts on all levels of speech production: articulation, phonation, respiration, and resonance. Thankfully, I'm not going to be delving into those specific areas today. That's not something that I was briefed to do, and I'm very glad for that. The early signs are typically mild voice problems leading to imprecise consonants. That would be slurring, colloquially. Hypernasality, that's too much air coming through the nose when people speak, and a harsh voice quality. And there are varying degrees of intelligibility depending on the context, depending on the environment people are in, and depending on their communication partner. And there's been some really nice experimental research on the different variables that impact on intelligibility. And this work is actually really fascinating. I'm a big fan of Julie Liss over in the States, who a while ago now described intelligibility as an emergent property of the listener. And I really like that. I mean, it's so simple, but it really elegantly describes intelligibility as something not necessarily belonging to the speaker of dysarthria, but the person who is listening to them. It's part of their story. But I'd actually go beyond that. And I'd say that intelligibility is a co-constructed property involving both speaker and their co-participant. So it's a very dynamic construct rather than just something that is unidirectional from the speaker to the listener. So again, I'm trying to invoke here a different way of thinking about communication rather than it being a speech signal approach where there's a deteriorating speech signal or there's a particular problem in the reception or the coding, that kind of very telegraphic model, which is going back some way now to a much more interesting dynamic concept of how communication works. And moving from speech, we know that in MND, other factors come into play. So language and cognition do matter. And I've got textbooks that I was using when I was a student back in the 80s, which clearly state that one of the few graces of MND is that it doesn't affect, as it was called then, people's intellect. And I think that was really denying the reality, which is, as we know now, up to a third, maybe more, of people with MND experience mild cognitive change, executive functioning, language, and social cognition. Unfortunately, up to 15% develop frontotemporal dementia, and that includes, again, executive planning, functioning, problem solving, shifting attention, initiating and inhibiting responses. And then we've also got understanding and producing spoken or written language. These are significant because they are impacting on communication, they're impacting on our care, on our ability to help people understand what's happening, help them plan for the future. So there is a lot behind the process of MND that still needs to be understood in more detail, particularly the interplay between speech, language, and cognition. And as I said, it's hard for me because I again would like to delve into this in much more depth, but I would encourage anyone who's interested in this to watch the 2018 annual Stephen Hawking lecture on cognitive and behavioural symptoms in MND, beautifully presented by Professor Steven Bloch. And there are also very, very good guides for professionals on cognition on the MNDA website. And I think cognition is worthy of attention because it's not well understood. We have this word cognition, but I know from our students that it's something you have to develop an understanding of. And it's only actually when you're working with people that you begin to appreciate that cognition is something that is manifest in behavior. So it's all very good assessing language, and it's all very good assessing the minutiae of how executive function works. But really, in the end, what we're interested in is how is it affecting people's day-to-day lives and how is it affecting the people around them? Because that's the thing that we're going to be targeting, particularly as clinicians. I just want to say, again, a little word before we do move on to conversation. And that is to talk about augmentative communication. Now, AAC, or augmentative alternative communication, or assistive communication technologies, are an incredibly important facet of MND communication. And there are a huge range of AAC systems that can be used, electronic, non-electronic. Their use will change in line with a person's underlying disease process. In the early stages, people might be quite happy using writing, but we know that as physical function deteriorates, there are eye gaze technologies, and then moving much more further to more simpler partner-assisted systems. So I don't want to give the game away here about where I'm going with this, but what I would say is that AAC is not a one-stop shop in MND. It's something that demands constant vigilance, constant change, and constant anticipation. And I always consider a combination of systems when I'm thinking about things. These might be unaided or aided, either electronic or non-electronic, but also other things that support decision-making. So talking maths, I know Joan Murphy and Sally Burr have been working on this for many, many, many years, and the MND was very important to Joan Murphy's early work. And I think that there are all sorts of interesting ways in which the use of symbols and the use of interactivity with symbols matters, particularly with MND. But also physical access to systems is key. So working with OTs and physios, as well as technologists and rehab engineers, AAC hubs, as they're called, are key for these more complex cases. And I think that we need to keep on top of AAC. But there's one model in particular that I want to share with you today, which I know many people are aware of, but I guess not everyone. And that's the really nice 4Ps model developed by Helen Robinson and Andrea Lee up at the Barnsley AAC Hub. And what I really like about the 4P is that it's simple. It's easy to remember. I'll tell you what I don't like about it in a minute, and I'm sorry, Helen and Andrea, I'll give you my critique. Let's just review what we've got here. Paper refers to any system that really isn't electronic, so picture books, writing, whatever. Howard just refers to any form of AAC that has some sort of external power source, battery or electricity. But really critical, the 4Ps of AAC, is that it's not just about the tech, it's about the person. Now, I think in this model, they refer to the fact that people themselves can be AAC systems in terms of signing or gesture. But I think Helen and Andrea would agree that it's not really just about the person as a tool for communication. It's about the person themselves. And that's where the fourth P comes into its own, because successful AAC is all about the partner as well. And I kind of feel that when I talk to speech therapy colleagues, that many therapists working in many, many areas have been sold on this for so many years. If you work with kids or adults with learning difficulties or people with dementia, working with and through communication partners is just so obvious. It's what people do. But I think that in the world of dysarthria and neurodegeneration, there is still perhaps a framework in which it's about the person. And that may come from kind of some of that kind of more neurological background, the more physical disability health background. But I know many therapists do adhere to this principle that partners matter, particularly as the disease progression means that people need more support. But actually how we work with partners and how we communicate with partners and their role within communication management, I think still needs addressing. That's something that I think we can talk about in a second. So what Helen and Andrea in their model say is that all of these P's are equal, they all matter, and they are all valuable. And as I said, I think if you're going to look at a model like this or a framework, this does a huge amount. What I would say is that AAC should always be people-focused. It's not about the technology. It's about the people using the technology. And as I said, I'm a bit cheeky now, but Helen and Andrea, the reason I didn't put up the model that you've kindly shared on Twitter is because you've used purple, and it is shocking, that colour. If I can make a change, if there's one thing I can do with this presentation, it's please change the background colour of your well-designed poster, and then I'll use it in its proper format. But I'm very grateful for your permission to use your concept today and to change it to fit my colour slide. I don't know if you know, Sean is if you can remember, is wearing a beautiful bow tie and shirt, and I can't even call it blue. There's got to be a beautiful name from Farrow and Ball, a waistcoat. And we didn't even communicate. Look, I'm wearing the same colour palette as well as my slide. So we are setting the standards here for the future, I think. Okay, so let's move on to conversation, because that's really what this is really all about. I've been studying conversation for a very long time. I've been interested in conversation and MND for over 20 years. And I don't think I've got a huge amount to show for it. I mean, I've got a lot of enthusiasm, and I have published quite a lot of work, but this is probably the first chance I've actually had to bring it all together in one go. So as I said, I'm grateful for lots of reasons for today's opportunity. In my work, I've been looking at how things go wrong and how people fix them. That's called repair. I've also been interested in how people adapt their turns, the turns that they take in conversation over time, using different forms of augmentative communication. I know that timing matters. I don't just mean in terms of when do you talk about things. We know that that matters. Voice banking, for example, you get that in early. I mean timing on a moment-by-moment basis. And we're going to look at that in a bit more detail with some videos in a second. But things like humour, things like teasing, things like introducing new topics are all very, very time dependent. And one theme that I keep coming back to in my research is what's called sequentiality, which is the way in which things follow each other in a logical sense, and the way in which people understand each other in a certain way. And one of the difficulties in MND, particularly when people become more and more unintelligible, is that repair and fixing problems with speech, or AAC terms themselves, becomes the business. It becomes what people have to do. And what lies behind what people are actually trying to say can sometimes get lost. So we might find that people are spending a lot of time trying to fix something that they haven't understood. And then when it's finally made intelligible, the conversation partner says, oh yeah, I get that now. But what on earth has that got to do with what we've been talking about? I've forgotten. And so we have this problem of sequentiality, where the sequence is broken down and then further repair work is needed. So timing really does matter. And it points to the critical role of the communication partner. And I would like to say, and again, I'm going to celebrate communication in a second, that it's not all doom and gloom. One of my most, I'd say, captivating cases that I keep coming back to is Alex and Molly. I'm not going to show you them today just for time, but in a number of publications and work still ongoing, we've looked at how these two people, a son and their mother, interact through a conversation, and how terms can be adapted to deal with deteriorating intelligibility. Alex was a relatively young man who was incredibly spiritful, incredibly playful, and he teased me like nothing. And I really warmed to him for that. In fact, Alex was so entrepreneurial. He was in a nursing home And a lot of the videos that I made of Molly, I was thinking, what's Molly doing? Why does she keep turning to the computer and putting CDs into the computer? And I asked Alex, and it turned out that he was running a business where the nurses would come in and ask him for copies of CDs. This is when CD music was around. And he'd basically be doing bootlegs for them all, including the artwork. So a lot of the conversations that we recorded, without me present, I should add, all my research is without a researcher present, is Molly, poor Molly, making these CDs that he then flogged to the nurses in the nursing home and the carers that came in. So he was running a very successful business. And because of that, he was somebody who interacted incredibly well. And he did it through spelling aloud. And that's what we've written about in a number of papers. But it wasn't about him spelling aloud. It wasn't him saying letter names that was the key. It was the way in which Molly, in particular, was able to interact with him in an incredibly tightly coordinated way. And I'll come back to using the term choreography and dance later with respect to conversation. But I would equate that much more to a dance than any other analogy I can think of. They were so in tune with each other that he would say something, she would say something, he would say something. And through that, they created meaning. And we've explored it in several different perspectives. But perhaps one of my most interesting papers, which I'm actually going to come back to because we wrote it back in 2013, myself and Ray Wilkinson, was on non-serious talk, as we called it, which is basically joking and teasing. And how they managed it in a context of severe speech disability. And they actually did it. And it's really interesting how they did it. And the reason I mention it is because we're hopefully just about to start some new work on laughter and communication. And Sophie Scott at UCL doesn't know this yet, but we did speak last week, and we're going to have a meeting. And I think what we're going to do is try and really, really pin this down, because I know she's got a great interest in laughter and humour. But we want to start looking at laughter and humour in a much more, again, systematic way, particularly from the perspective of speech disability. Okay, what I want to come up to now, before we go back to our wonderful conversation couple, is that it's not only looking through a lens of deterioration. So if we look at work by Cathy Yorkston in the 1980s, 90s, she presented a very neat framework of how to treat communication change in MND as speech deteriorates. So an intelligibility-led approach. And if you look at her texts, which are great, it's very much about saying this is what you would do with someone with normal speech, with relatively impaired speech, with severely impaired speech, to no speech. So it's very much based on physical deterioration of the speech signal and the different things that we can do. But I've kind of tried to play around with different ways of actually conceptualizing change in dysarthria, particularly from an interaction perspective. And some work that we did, again, a couple of years ago now, but I still think has salience, is to think about profiling people as a couple, as a dyad, rather than just the individual, because I think the communication partner really does matter when it comes to conversation. How could they not? So we might think of, we use colours rather than numbers, just because it seemed more, it gave more balance. And we showed, back in the day, a group of 10 speech therapists. I locked them in a room, poor things, with lots of biscuits and coffee, and said, right, I'm going to show you, I think we had 40 video clips from 10 different dyads, and they had to rate the video clips in terms of interaction, perception, rather like you did when you watched the video earlier. And they were incredibly consistent. It was a really good effect. But the finding was basically that speech disability alone, or intelligibility change, is not a good guide to how we rate interactivity and good conversation. So it's exactly as you found earlier, a very robust finding. Just because someone's speech is deteriorating doesn't mean that they're not a good interactor communicator. It really does depend on the communication partner. And that might guide us to how we might want to think about how we target intervention in the future. If you've got a couple who have got some observable or reported change in the interaction of either conversation partner, the yellow profile, you might be thinking about certain things, as opposed to the purple profile, which would be significant interaction challenges encountered by both conversation partners, independent of the change in speech. So this really pays attention to the fact that even a mild dysarthria can have a significant effect on people's interaction, but a significant speech problem may not have an equal effect on interaction. So there are complex variables at play in how people are interacting. Right, the big question. So this is where we're building up to. What makes a conversation good? Okay, why was the video that we watched of Jean and Ali so good for most of us? Okay, I asked people through Twitter last week, and I got back some incredibly important reflections. Some people were very, they emailed me and they said, look, my mum has dementia, or my grandfather had MND or whatever. So I got a really impressive range of responses about what makes a conversation good. And this is some, I'm sorry I haven't mentioned everyone. It wasn't possible to kind of collect everything, but these are some of the range of responses we had. It's about a connection, about feeling included. It's the back and forth, the collaborative effort, sharing, reciprocity, balance. It's about value, respect, and equality, active listening, unexpected twists and turns, good conversational space. Thank you, Jennifer. That's a really lovely way of phrasing it. Resilience, being real with someone, which we'll come back to. Good enough. A good conversation just has to be good enough. Thank you, Fiona. It was great to hear from you about this sense of we're not looking at perfection here. We're just looking at things working. Being able to discuss big and small things, whatever that means, that seems incredibly significant. When the magic happens and the connection flows freely without barriers, that was a much more eloquent way of putting this sense of reciprocity. And conversations that aren't always easy can be good too. What an important thing to say here, because this isn't just about having fun or having close conversations. It can also be having conversations that are hard for people, but they can be good when they work. And I'm going to come back to my wonderful colleague, Charles Antaki, and he was a bit cheeky. In a classic sense, I asked the question, Charles. I said, what's a good conversation? And he said, what a great and challenging question. I look forward to you telling us. Now, that in my book is a response. It's not the answer that I was after. And Charles is incredibly clever. And I don't know whether he was being deliberately mischievous, but in some respects, I really appreciate the response you gave us. Am I going to be able to tell you what a good conversation is? I'm not sure. Let's see what we can do. Okay. Here are 4 constructs that I want to talk us through. And we're going to have some videos to demonstrate this. Okay, so this is kind of based on all of the video work that I've been doing, all of the work I've been doing with conversation analysis, all of the people I've worked with MND, the clinicians I've worked with, colleagues I've worked with. So this is a huge melting pot of stuff. And you don't have to agree with it, because that's not what this is about. But I want to challenge us as a community to think about these constructs, because they're not the things that we would necessarily be thinking about when we meet someone with MND for the first time and we're thinking, right, how do I understand their communication? So let's work through these 4 things. The first one is authenticity. Now, I haven't really got a video for this because it's actually quite a difficult construct. When I started doing this, I thought, well, this is a great word. I like, everyone likes authenticity, man. We're all trying to be authentic and be true. And then I thought, oh God, what have I got myself into? So I figured, let's be authentic. What's the authentic me? Because this to me is about being who you are. And that's not always easy if you don't know who you are. Some people never know who they are. But what is it that drives you? What is it about your life that matters? And it struck me that authenticity is one thing that I feel has made, for me, communicating with friends, with family, with peers, with people with MND, a closer thing. There's something about the connectivity that comes through authenticity. So I'm sorry, this is very personal. I can't believe I'm showing this with everyone, but I'll do it anyway. Okay, so here are some pictures just coming up of me and my life. And they're quite random. There's me with my family in the top left. There's me with a great friend, Jake, who lives in New York now. He's a famous photographer. I'm so envious. He just has met everybody you could possibly imagine and photographed them in a very understated way. And he just never ceases to. We pick up the phone to each other now and again, and it's like the conversation hasn't stopped. You know, do you have people like that sometimes in your life where you might not talk to them for a year or two, and then you just hear their voice, and it's just like, so yeah, I was in the pub last night with Mike, and it's like, hang on, we haven't spoken for a year, but we just can carry on. How is that possible? There's me at work. That one on the right there, that's Mortimer. That's our standard wire-head dachshund. He barks a lot. He needs more baths than is probably healthy for dogs because he likes to roll in things he shouldn't do. But he's part of my life. He's my authenticity. And if I talk about Mortimer, people like to talk. In fact, when I take Mortimer out for walks, I stroll around Brighton looking like a typical Brightonian. People stop me and they want to talk. It's conversation. Of course, they don't really want to talk to me. They want to talk to Mortimer. But it's still interesting how people use the things around them, in this case, Mortimer, that stimulate conversation. It might be the how I like to look there on the bottom right, how I like to dress up on a Sunday, friends, work, things I do. There's Charles. Hello, Charles. They're just on the to the right at the bottom, and then there's Merle, a great colleague at the UCL. There are many, many people and valued friends and family who haven't got space to put in those photographs. I just wanted to share with you that these are things that matter to me. They're my past, they're my present, and they help shape the future. And for me, it's about how I build and maintain relationships, particularly in a professional context. So we talk about the therapeutic alliance and that sense of sharing identities. And I think that the more we are able, in a very careful way, to disclose things about ourselves and who we are, the easier it is to both build and maintain relationships, which are very, very important for conversation. So there's just a sense of what we mean by authenticity. But let's get back to our wonderful subjects for the day, Jean and Ali. And I just want to talk about this second construct, which is attention, listening, and showing understanding. So let's just have a look at the video. So all of these videos demonstrate everything. So it doesn't really matter what I show you. I chose 3 clips now because I just think it makes it real. Rather than talking about conversation, it's really important to observe conversation. There are no more questions to ask you, no more polls. So just enjoy this sense of the importance of attention, listening, and showing understanding.
Okay, I'm ready. Finished. Wednesday. Mike. Okay. Friday. Okay. Give me a clue before you start spelling me, and I've got an idea. Is that a name, Mike? That'll give me an idea. I think, what's that? Mickey? I've got Matt Monkey. You know what spelling's like. Mike's coming Friday.
Okay. So there is a huge amount going on there. And certain people will be looking at that and saying, please, let's talk about modality. Please, let's start looking at the way in which Jean uses her hands, the way she uses finger spelling, writing. They matter. Of course they matter. They are incredible strengths here. And part of understanding conversation is about identifying strengths or facilitators to communication. But I really, really want to focus on what Ali is doing as the conversation partner. One of the reasons why this conversation works, and the first one that you rated as being a good conversation, why it works, is because of what Ali is doing, as well as what Jean is doing. Ali is really attending to what Jean is doing. She's listening, and she's actively showing her understanding. I chose that clip actually deliberately because there are key points there where Ali goes beyond what is normal and is explicitly referencing each part of her understanding, which is incredibly important for Jean. And, I'm not going to give you the background to Jean because we don't need that, but she is a woman with motor neurone disease. And as you can see, she has no functional speech. So she is a very kind of pure case of disaster here. We're not seeing the upper and lower limb weakness and deterioration that we will see with many other people with MND. We're focusing just on communication and speech here. But she has got a significant problem. And yet they are working together in an incredibly tight, coordinated way. So there is clearly a very, very important construct of attention, listening and sharing understanding, which I think for clinicians watching today, we don't always necessarily target in our intervention. We might mention the importance of listening. We know listening is important as a construct, but how do you listen? How do you show you've understood on a moment-by-moment basis? So there are some very key skills coming on there. The third element of the four was turn-taking and reciprocity and timing. And I just want to reflect on the importance, as I said, of this two and forth, back and forth movement that is important in conversation.
The rabbit. It's in the box. It's in the garden. It's outside. X. Oh, the dead one. The dead rabbit. The dead rabbit. Yeah, that's all been buried now. Yeah, she was buried last night. So. But Jack seems to be okay now. Now we've buried her. I think she was just.
Okay, I'm so sorry. That is actually called the dead rabbit clip. It sounds like a Monty Python sketch, doesn't it? But it's. This is about everything we're seeing, the ability for people to take turns, the ability to take a next turn that is fitted to the one that's just happened. And that might be a sense of voicing what someone has just seen, as we eloquently see there with the rabbit and the dead rabbit, and the timing that comes in with that and with the laughter. But I'm going to just move us on now, because I am aware of the time, and I want to start kind of moving this into the kind of final section with maybe just 5 or 6 minutes to go. And that's, for me, the most important element, which is intimacy and collusion. And I use the term intimacy particularly here, not in a physical sense, although physical intimacy is an incredibly important feature of communication. I mean it in terms of communicative intimacy and the ways in which people are able to share a closeness. I've typically understood intimacy, for me, and collusion in terms of risk-taking. A very easy example would be to tell a joke. So if I've got Sean, as I said, up at the spin, if I wanted to make Sean laugh, I would probably tell him a dirty joke. And I know that he'd get that. He's laughing already. He doesn't even know what the joke is. I'm not going to tell a dirty joke now, because that would be highly unprofessional. But we know from previous research, in fact, going back to the founder of conversation analysis, Harvey Sachs, that dirty jokes have a huge amount behind them in terms of what you do say, what you don't say, but the way in which you invite people in to your world and how you collude with them. So if I, for example, wanted to collude now with Sean, and I'm really sorry people can't actually see this, but I'll describe it anyway. If I wanted to do gossip, which I love the study of gossip. I love gossip myself. Who doesn't love gossip? Come on. Gossip is about talking about things and taking risks. And if I said to Sean, Sean, don't, this is just between you and me. He's already smiling again. He's leaning into the camera. You know Jean, and he's nodding now. He's raising his eyebrows. Well, you know Jean, and you know that guy that lives 5 doors down from you. And he's really interested. He's stroking his beard in a very interactive style, which suggests to me he really wants to know the gossip. And that's the point at which I've roped him in. And I know that he really wants to know the gossip, and he is colluding with me. So I've taken the risk of introducing concepts and terms and actions that would allow us to move forward with something which is potentially transgressive or taboo or whatever it might be. And that intimacy and collusion is, I think, something that many people do, some people don't, but is potentially another marker of what enables us to be human and to show who we are. And all of these things are at risk for somebody with a severe communication disability. The ability to do things in a timely way, the ability to talk about things in a way that makes sense to your conversation partner. So, this really does matter. MND is not just about speech, and it's not just about replacing speech with AAC. It's about understanding the context within which communication operates, particularly at a conversational level. So we'll just watch the last video. I don't think there's anything too naughty that goes on in this one, but we can just have a quick look.
What have you written? Scholarship. What is scholarship? How do they work out who has a scholarship? Put your glasses on. Well, you apply for them. They work out what they're going to.
Okay, so the collusion and intimacy there is very gentle. It's somebody teasing someone else about something that they've written. Jean spots it before she even gives it to her. She's looking at her pen and paper going, "Oh God, I've made a spelling mistake there. Who blames us? Spelling scholarship is not a common word." She spells it wrong. She hands it over to Ali, and Ali says, "What's a scholarship? Who's going to?" She repeats it a number of times, which builds up the tease. And Jean is obviously engaged in the laughter as well. And then we have the kind of put your glasses on. It is an intimate moment. It's a collusion. I'm not sure I could have gone into Jean's world and done the same thing, but I may have done had I been her therapist, got to know her better, that we might have had that level of intimacy where the teasing was allowed. And I think that, again, is a very important construct in the way in which people share their identity. Okay, we've just got, I'd say I'm allowed 4 more minutes. I think that's fair. Otherwise, I'll just get cut off, and that will be very difficult for everyone. So I'm just going to talk about the few final slides, and then we can round off with some questions. All of this has led me to thinking about developing a better conversations approach to MND communication. And this wouldn't be possible without the wonderful collegiality and support of Suzanne Beek, who is my colleague at UCL, but also the wider Better Conversations Lab, particularly Anna Volkmer and others, who are looking at conversation in this kind of structured way. Suzanne is heavily invested in aphasia and dementia, Anna Volkmer in progressive primary aphasia, but we're now also moving into other areas. I'm currently funded to develop an intervention called Better Conversations for Parkinson's, so thank you to Parkinson's UK for funding that. And that's led ably by our researcher, Philippa Clay, who's a speech therapist. So that's a feasibility study. But I want to talk about a better conversations approach to AAC and speech in MND. Why do this? Well, we feel, or I feel particularly, that working on speech in isolation and AAC rarely addresses the communication problem as fully as it should. I think that in working on speech and AAC alone, it means there's no room for building on existing skills, really. People with MND are experts in their own communication and interaction. We, as professionals, bring other expertise, but it's always the person living with MND and their family who really understand their own communication. And these significant speech problems in AAC use must be conceptualized in terms of opportunities for interaction and participation. We have to bring the concepts of participation together in order to improve our interventions. So, what characterises a conversation approach to MND? Everyday conversation is more representative than a formal assessment. Both communication partners matter. It recognises and uses existing skills in conversation, the conversation fingerprint. It accepts and works with change over time, conversations with speech and mediated through AAC. Goal setting is seen as using a meaningful facilitators and barriers approach for each dyad. There's choice, but there's also tailoring to the individual. And the importance of practice, behaviour change, theory principles. And I'm really pleased to say that Suzanne and myself have a book coming out, hopefully early in the new year, called Better Conversations with Communication Disabilities, a practical guide for clinicians. So we've turned these concepts and these approaches into something we hope that clinicians can use on a practical day-to-day basis and understand what we mean by better conversations. When it comes to facilitators and barriers, we're talking about things that enable conversations to flow. Writing a word when you can't say it, giving someone more time to speak. But we're also looking at reducing the barriers for each dyad. Things that cause difficulties. Asking additional questions when an AAC turn is in progress, for example. What might be a barrier for one couple might be a facilitator for another. So completing someone's turn before they finish speaking might be actually useful, but it might also be problematic. The important thing is that people themselves decide what works for them. So, better conversations, cycle of therapy is based on real-life talk, about knowledge about how communication works, the use of video, identifying what's happening in those videos, what could you have done differently, identifying barriers and facilitators for goal setting, and practicing using strategies. I've only got 2 more slides left. We're nearly there. If I was to say what makes us as professionals effective in our conversations with people living with MND, I'd say building and maintaining a relationship. That's what really matters. It's about being who you are, both an expert in X and a human being who's already an excellent communicator, but not always. We can't always be good at communication. Accepting that we're an expert in X, but that people living with MND and their significant others are experts in their own lives. Agreeing what's going to work best when communicating and that this will change over time. Sometimes communication is challenging, and the trick is not giving up and learning what works best over time. Accepting that AAC solutions can't replicate existing skilled modalities. Most AAC-mediated interactions take longer, and that's okay. It's not a problem, but we can't expect AAC to just replicate what we would consider natural, timely communication. Using technologies will always be different from our experiences of real-time, co-present conversation. I would love to be with you all in a room at the moment. I think Sean would be as well. It just creates a completely different feel for how interaction and conversation and communication works. And it's fine. You know, we like Zoom, we like Teams. We've done amazing things with it over the past few years, and it enables us to communicate with people all around the world in a very different way. But every time I go back to UCL Chandler House and I am working with my colleagues in the same room, working with students face to face, it feels so different. And finally, allowing time and space to listen, understand, and talk. This can be the most challenging, but also the most rewarding. It takes practice and self-awareness, but we have to be curious. And I always, as I know Idris said last year in his lecture, look at the Catherine Mannix book, 2021, Listen. That's the title of the book. It's an incredibly powerful book for really reshaping what we understand by the word listen and how it impacts at end-of-life care. And finally, thank you so much for your patience. I'm going to end with one more slide. It's a quote. I spent about 4 weeks thinking about my last slide. How sad is that? But it matters. Okay. It seems relevant to come back to Stephen Hawking at this point. Remember to look up at the stars and look down at your feet. Try to make sense of what you see and wonder about what makes the universe exist. Be curious. And however difficult life may seem, there is always something you can do and succeed at. It matters that you don't just give up. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Stephen. That has been, it's just flown by for me. I'm sure it's the same for people out there in the internet world. It's just been so wonderful to hear so many different aspects of conversation and things that I immediately recognise of some of my more enjoyable conversations. And, you know, I didn't think I'd tonight be thinking about colour schemes, intimacy and dirty jokes, but there we have it. Thank you. So we have some questions coming through, so do ask your questions at this juncture. I'll just let Stephen take a quick drink and wet his whistle, as it were, and then we'll start with the questions from the audience. So the first question is from Hannah Britton from QMU. Hannah wonders if you use any formal approaches to conversational partner training. I'm familiar with approaches commonly used in aphasia, such as Better Conversations with Aphasia, but I'm not aware of any MND specific resources. Do you tend to take a more informal approach? Thank you.
I'm a very, very informal therapist. I believe in the art of therapy, which is it's a bit of a lost phrase. In fact, when I was a student, we were asked a voice question by Lorna Povey. I don't know if Lorna's still working clinically. I hope you are, Lorna, but you inspired me with one of your exam questions, which you wouldn't get away with these days. It just wouldn't pass muster. But it was something like, voice therapy is both a science and an art. Discuss. And it was one of those kind of things where you just had to make it up as you went along. But it really resonated in terms of therapy being evidence-based where it can be, bearing in mind that the evidence comes from all different sorts of sources, not just trials and formal research, but that sense of intuition about what makes us tick as human beings. And I think that skilled therapy is about really integrating your art, your skill, your experiences, as well as the evidence. So I do take an informal approach, yes, but in answer to the question, which is important, we are now looking at Better Conversations MND as a structured, manualized therapy approach. I met with wonderful colleague, Chris McDermott, who is up at Sheffield, who is just doing the most amazing things and continues to do the most amazing things. And has his name on almost everything to do with MND these days, which is great to see. And we are talking about developing a research bid for developing Better Conversations with MND. What that looks like, we don't yet know. It might be a very practical tool that we develop, hopefully with the MNDA. If there is anyone from the MNDA listening, then maybe we can have a conversation very soon, because I think it would be great to get videos like the ones we've shown today on a dedicated platform on the website where we can actually illustrate different ways of approaching conversation in MND. So there's work to be done there. But in answer to your question, yes, we've got the book coming out next year, which does talk about the broad principles of Better Conversations as a therapy approach, which could be very happily applied to MND. I'd also like to reference things like Liz Stokoe's CALM approach and work by Ruth Parry, also at Loughborough, who's got a good package for more end-of-life palliative care, which are different types of things. They're not necessarily speech therapy approaches, but they have broad principles behind them that enable us to work with people reflecting. I guess that's the common thing here. It's about reflecting on communication, on your own communication. They're not communication partner training packages in their own right, but they lend themselves very much to what we would think of as communication partner training. But I think for me, what matters is that we don't treat communication partners as a separate entity. Ideally, wherever possible, we should be theraping with a dyad or a family unit, because I think that's where the most impactful changes can be made. And that means people really understanding what conversation is and understanding their own conversation, so that conversation partners become a very integral part of the story. And if you think about child-parent interaction, for example, that's the model. You've got it there. You've got people already working in this model. It's just that we've never really applied it to progressive neuro conditions in this way.
Thanks, Stephen. So the next, it's more of a comment plus question from Fiona Campbell from HCPC. I also believe in the art of our job. Not working at the level of conversation is possibly one of my biggest clinical regrets, looking back on my clinical life to date. I appreciate we didn't always have the evidence for it throughout all of my career, and there was perhaps hyper focus on individual elements of speech, language, communication. As I matured, I got more comfortable understanding the crucial SLT role in conversation. Keen to hear some quick tips, quick takeaways for implementing this in daily clinical practice, especially when the family might be focused on those individual elements separately?
That's so salient, because we find this with other conditions. People who've had stroke, aphasia, they want to work on word finding, and that's perfectly understandable. There is absolutely no problem in running a better conversations approach in parallel with other approaches. So this is never about saying other things aren't important. There is very little evidence. I must add that in. Our world of speech and language therapy, we talk about evidence all the time, but the evidence base for our profession is very, very low. We know that, and we've got big aspirations for the future, but every single study that comes out adds a tiny bit of evidence. We'd all love the final big piece of the jigsaw, but all you're ever going to do with studies is adding in little bits and pieces here and there. But that's what science is all about. So it's kind of incumbent upon us to think, how do we make change that's meaningful? Now, I think that if people say, I want to work on my speech, and that's not quite the question you're asking, but I think it's kind of there in the background. We have to be very careful, because we can't give people false hope that somehow working on speech exercises is going to stem the flow of MND. MND is a disease process. It has a pathology, which, as Kristen rightly pointed out a couple of years ago, we don't fully understand anyway. I mean, we've got all of this science, all of this genetic research, but MND itself is a very generic term, and there may well be a number of different disease processes that we're dealing with here. So at that level, it's almost impossible to think, well, what could we do with speech in isolation? But I think that working with people means building that relationship, which means you can build the intimacy and the collusion and the trust. That's not a word that I used earlier. When you've got the trust of the people you're working with, it enables you to be much more honest and open about the things that you really want to talk about. And again, the big elephant in the room with MND is deterioration. We have to go at our client's pace. It's not advised. You want a quick tip? Don't ever go in and say, right, let's have a look at augmentative communication. That's not the way we're going to work. But we do have to have staged conversations that enable us to move in the directions that we as professionals need people to move to. And that's the same with enteral feeding. It's the same with advanced care planning, end-of-life planning. As I said, today's presentation wasn't necessarily about how do we do those things. That's a different lecture completely. But I think it touches on this sense of therapists feeling comfortable enough and authentic enough and brave enough, we have to be bold, to actually have these conversations with our clients, because nobody else is going to talk about communication in the way that speech therapists will. That's our job. That is our absolutely fundamental mission, accepting dysphagia and swallowing as well. But speech therapists need to be taking charge of communication and championing communication and promoting communication and conversation, as otherwise it just gets lost in the mix of so many other issues. And I think that communication sits at the heart of everything. So I'm sorry, I'm drifting. In terms of tips, get communication in early and really get to know your neurologists and the team, because it is a team approach, so that you get those referrals early. Because the earlier the referral, the easier it is to build the relationship, the easier it is to do the voice banking and the AAC prep and the relationship building, so that the tricky, sticky stuff about relationships and conversations can then be built.
Super, thank you. Emma Jackson from St Richard's Hospice would like to know, do you follow a step ladder of progressing through different communication modalities with patients?
It's a really nice visual concept, isn't it? Step ladders. Yeah, I mean, I think we come back to that point that in your head you've got a sense of deterioration and knowing what that might look like, but what you don't have is the rate of change and also the way in which the people you're working with are going to be reacting to that. So I don't work clinically now, but in my kind of virtual clinical world, I'm taking a very, very organic isn't the right word, a reflective approach to therapy. What I really want to do is understand where the client and their communication partners are coming from. So I guess the difference between me now and me when I was a early 20-something speech therapist is, first of all, I care less about what other people think about me. So there's that sense of the authenticity. I'm not trying to be a model speech therapist. I realise that I am the therapist and that's it. So I can be a bit more honest with people. I can be myself. And that enables me perhaps to say, okay, this is my stall. This is the way in which I'm going to work. And I'm only repeating something that a good colleague of mine, Dawn Devonish, many years ago said. That was her way of putting it. And at the time, I didn't really understand what she meant. I thought she was a bit cranky. And now I'm that person. I'm exactly the same as you, Dawn, about kind of thinking about things in a completely different way as a speech therapist and not worrying that there's a perfect answer out there. I'll tell you what I don't do. I never rush anymore. I'm much more considered in giving people a lot more time. And that is attention. We haven't drifted yet into service provision and what's
Well, I was just going to say, Steve, sorry to jump in, but a question from Emma Shah, who's an independent SLT, says, when people with MND have so little time with their SLTs and they may be seen by outpatient, inpatient, community teams and so on, how do we choose what to spend time on and help people with MND to choose for themselves and have that co-production approach? And how do short episodes of care with different SLTs cover all those things? So it's a really kind of that tension, if you'd like to talk a little bit about that.
It is tension. Can I just say hello, Emma? We used to work together when we were graduates down in West Sussex, and I know that we've kind of kept in touch loosely, but it's lovely to hear from you recently, and your work, international work, is such an inspiration. So thank you, Emma, for everything you've done for the profession. Anyway, let me get back to the point. Okay, so yes, these are tensions, aren't they? And I would say that where you can begin to make change is in the concepts and the philosophies of the colleagues around you. So this is a tall order, but anyone that's been working for quite a while as a therapist begins to see, I suppose it's a leadership thing, where you can begin to say, look, we need to make change. We need to understand where our clients are coming from. But this doesn't necessarily fit the model of delivery that we've got in our area. People are moving, as you say, through different things. Now, I think that we've got some scope here. We've been talking about technology a bit today and some of the limitations, but just think about the advantages of what we could be doing with technologies in terms of getting people together, sharing ideas, building communities of practice, particularly around progressive neurological conditions, so that therapists can build up their awareness and their approaches and their commonality of approaches throughout the patient journey. And I suppose it's about developing frameworks of care. And my experience of MND in the past was always very positive for that. So, Emma, you'll have remembered the work that we used to do to kind of together in the trust that we worked in. We never discharged people with MND. Admittedly, I was working in the community, as I know that you did too, and we were perhaps slightly rogue. We used to go out there and we didn't really care that we had to fill in forms to tell people what we were doing every minute. We just made it up because we felt it was integral to meet our clients' needs. Now, that's not to say that therapists can all go rogue, but there is something important, particularly about community clinicians who have hopefully a little bit more scope for that time with people in their own environments. So I think a conversation approach can still be developed within a hospital setting. It can certainly be developed in a hospice setting at end of life. I think that's really important work. But in that in-betweeny bit where people are changing and they're living at home, ideally, it should be done through domiciliary work. But can I just add one more thing? And again, this came from a conversation with Chris McDermott last week. It may well be that conversation is owned by us all. In fact, it is owned by us all. So speech therapists may be the people that have got the expertise in setting things up, but it doesn't mean necessarily that speech therapists have to be the ones who are implementing and working with people on a regular basis. So I think there's more scope here for how we use other people to become the conversation champions, as it were, in our environments. It could be nurses, it could be OTs, it could be other healthcare professionals involved. It's a tricky thing to start developing, but I think we've got some sense of broadening and letting go of some of the things that we hold on to enable other professionals to share their own expertise. I'm sorry, I mean, I'm doing my classic, I'm just talking.
No, it's really fascinating, Stephen, and I really agree with you about, really centering our service users. And if we need to challenge the current care pathways and the professional silos, I think I fully agree with you, really. It's really good to hear these things. So I've got another question from Polly Burton from City. Said it was really interesting to see how gesture and sign gave, I think it was June, a voice. And I wondered if the use of sign is becoming more accepted or encouraged modality for language and communication.
I think so. Signing is wonderful, isn't it? Okay, so the kind of one of the reveals here is that for Jean and Ali, that's not her real name, but she's out there. I know worked in an environment where signing, Makaton, sign along, whatever, was finger spelling too, as we saw, was part of her role, her professional role. So I'm thinking, I can't think of any other way how this happened, that she was able to help her mum develop those skills too. Finger spelling is quite an advanced skill. I've tried it myself. It's like all things, unless you're doing it all the time, you just kind of forget, you might just about get the vowels right and a few of the letters, but it's not an intuitive thing. So where it's possible, then I think it's certainly part of our toolkit. And there is absolutely no reason that if you've got signing skills yourself, why that can't be used within an MND environment. Obviously, it's not going to work for everyone at a cognitive level, at a desirability level, or most obviously at a physical level. But I think that, yes, I think people are much more aware of signing as a language. They see it, it's much more visible. It's part of mainstream culture. Once something's made into Strictly, you know that it's part of the real world. So we've had people with disabilities much more prevalent in popular culture. And I think that's a really important story. I'm drifting off again, aren't I, now into how do absolutely. I mean, and actually, it is about that visibility and acceptability, isn't it? And that holistic approach. So, no, I think you're right to drift off. These kind of, the word that keeps popping into my mind is synergy and interchangeability, and I think that you've really talked very, very inspirationally about those things tonight. There's a couple of themes coming. There are a couple of questions, one from Sally and one from Janice, really thinking about those kind of inconsistent support where people are either in inpatient settings and lots of different communication partners are coming along, or there are maybe people who are a bit more isolated. What kind of things can we do to bring better conversations to those situations? The first one is easier, institutional. Okay, so I spoke to the Better Conversations Lab last week, actually. We talked about Better Conversations professionals. So this is about, many of us have done training days or training events for professionals. And the success of these things really does vary. I think we all enjoy doing training. Everyone loves doing training and everyone loves talking about communication. How effective those training events are is a different matter. So I can certainly remember doing many things in nursing homes, many things in hospitals, when you get everyone in the room and you say, this is what communication is, this is how it goes wrong, and this is what we can do about it. And that's very information heavy. So I'd be quite kind of judgmental about the impact of that kind of stuff. But if you've got a very specific issue, which is a unit or a ward or an institution where there's a lot of change and you've got things happening, then taking an institution approach seems to be a really healthy thing to do. I mentioned Liz Stokoe's CALM approach earlier, CARM, and it is worth having a look at because it's about getting a bunch of people together with a common focus. It could be any institutional focus. It could be the police. It could be the work she's done with crisis negotiators, whatever. I mean, the most amazing work. And they are basically taking the the lid off communication, looking what's inside and using their own skill and their own expertise in communication from whatever background they come in to think about their own areas of work. And I think that lends itself really, really well to institutions where everyone works together, but they never ever have thought about how do we communicate with people in this way. So I think communication disability particularly is an area that people are quite afraid of. Dare I say that healthcare professionals aren't always good at communicating with people with communication. They're not good at communicating with the normal public, let alone people with communication difficulties. So we've got this challenge of kind of saying, well, what is good communication again? It's not about skills. It's about approach. It's about philosophy. It's about attitude. And I can say it's not about education level. I mean, I've been into nursing homes where there are the most amazing communicators who just get it. And English isn't their first language. They've come from, completely different cultures, which is another issue that we need to be talking about today, which is how does this work translate to different cultures within the UK or internationally? Can you take a conversational approach that meets the needs of the local population, bearing in mind that different cultures have different ways of doing conversation? I think you can. I'm going to come back to the point, though, which is institutions are relatively straightforward, I think, but working with people who are in isolation is a completely different thing. And we've assumed throughout my whole presentation that people live in neat dyads, the nuclear family, you've got siblings, you've got children, you've got partners, parents, whatever. There are people that don't have anyone. And that's a challenge. And I think that there it becomes more of a participation issue and a public health issue with respect to the ability to engage with people around you. It brings in issues of loneliness. So I think there are other constructs to be brought in. But wherever possible, work with a communication partner. And it doesn't matter who it is. It's just somebody who knows the person that you're working with. So I would find working with an individual now really constraining. And wherever possible, I would say try and identify somebody in that person's life that you can treat as well as. That becomes the therapy unit. It's not an add-on. That's why I don't like using the word communication partner, because it kind of somehow gives them a funny sort of status. I want to talk about co-participants, people who are equal and bring something together.
Super. Thank you, Stephen. So we've got a question from Mark Jays from MMU. Thank you for a wonderful talk, Stephen. What are your thoughts on using a CA approach to explore facilitators and barriers to successful shared decision-making for people living with MND?
Yes, shared decision-making, how wonderful. Okay, so I just referred to the work by Camille Painter, who was doing some nice work, and I think some publications have already come out there on decision making, particularly in the context of communication and cognition. So there is already work going on decision making, and Anna Krivoshnikova, who's one of my PhD students with Ammar Al-Chalbi at King's, is also just about to start collecting data, looking at how people with MND and communication problems interact with different healthcare professionals over time. So there's a couple of really nice important variables there, which is change over time, but also interacting with different professionals. We're hoping to get video data of clients in conversations with speech therapists, physios, dietitians, neurologists. It'll be interesting to see how they communicate. They're not going to like that. And we get all sorts of interest. I'm being a bit cheeky because I can be with them because they hold so much privilege and power. But yes, we need to look at everyone's communication. And I think that you've hit on the theme there, which is decision making. And that's one of the differences. So a lot of the healthcare work that goes on is about making decisions. And I think it's incredibly important that we empower people to understand how decisions are made and their role in that decision making. And as you say, the barriers and the facilitators. So there is no reason why a better conversations approach couldn't be focused on specific areas of interest, like the decision-making process. I think the challenge is that decision-making is a very insidious thing. Most things don't just happen in one place in a conversation. They're really cleverly distributed. And that's why conversation analysis for me is such a wonderful thing, because it really does make you take a step back, become more of an anthropologist, and think, how on earth do we do the things that we do? Dirty jokes being one clever, nice example. How on earth do we do dirty jokes? We do them in a very clever way. How on earth do we do flirting? How do we do gossiping? How do we do more serious things like disagreeing? Very rarely do we say, I disagree. It's not as obvious as that. It's a very interesting reflexive process where each turn in the conversation builds on what was prior and shape what comes next. And that's why we need to look at these sequences. There's a lot of work that needs to be done, but there's also a huge amount that has already been done in the in what we would call non-speech disordered populations that we could look at to inform our approach as speech therapists. So yeah, Mark, I'm just coming back to your point. Decision-making, conversation analysis, better conversations, they all would work together really, really well. And I think there'll be some lovely project work to come out of that as well.
Wonderful. Hello to Joe Jackson at Merseyside NHS Foundation Trust. Thank you for your question, which is, do you find that people with MND and their partners have to go through a period of adjustment before they fully engage with the better conversations approach, or because people often just want exercises or fixing in inverted commas?
Well, first of all, we've yet to actually trial a better conversations approach with people with MND. So I did some proof of concept work a few years ago with people with Parkinson's disease and multiple sclerosis. And it was just because of who we had around at the time.
Oh, Nick says, sorry to interject, Nick says, could you repeat the research study you mentioned for Parkinson's, which would be helpful?
Yes, so it's called Better Conversations with Parkinson's, and it's funded by Parkinson's UK. And I tell you what I'll do, anything I've mentioned today, in passing, so I know sometimes I can whiz through things, I will send to somebody, probably the technical people who have set this up, and I think that they will be able to put up the slides, but also a reading list and additional resources list. So I hope that's possible. I'm sure we can do it through the MNDA or RCSLT website. So there'll just be something that goes with that. So don't worry about anything I've mentioned. I will remember it all somehow, and it will all come back and I'll put it all up. So what was the question? Where were we before you rudely
sorry about that. Do you find that people with MND, it was about, them adjusting to that approach?
Yeah, so this is, I think, when do you do stuff with MND? I mean, someone's diagnosed, it's potentially, from my own perspective, devastating to be given a diagnosis, although many people will already suspect that something's wrong and that the diagnosis can, as we know from research, can often be delayed because of all sorts of things. And that's why a good neurologist is so invaluable. And the MND networks, the care centres are invaluable. So the process through which people go through. And I think that most neurologists that specialise in MND that I've met are incredibly sensitive to this process of adjustment and are very, very good at deciding how to present MND, to prepare people for MND. I know that Amar at King's is he mentions this a number of times, the way in which he will tell somebody and give that diagnosis, but then has a very, very clear route for saying, okay, today we've done this bit, you're going to come back very soon, and we're going to carry on with the next bit where you can process things and you can have somebody with you. And the use of specialist nurses who are incredibly skilled. Now, anyone that's working in MND, after a while, just because of the experiences they have, becomes very sensitive, I think, to those subtle clues that enable you to say, today we can go this little bit further, or your words matter. I'm going to really listen to the way in which you're framing the problems you bring, and I'm going to work with that. And that's what I meant about the art. This isn't something that you could plug into an algorithm. I would be horrified to think that some bot at Google is coming up with an AI device that's going to say, and now you can plug yourself into the manage your MND module. It's not like that. It's incredibly reflexive to exactly what you're seeing and hearing at that particular moment. And so there's the art, there's the skill of the therapist to actually think, okay, at what point of adjustment are you at? How do I judge that? There are scales of adjustment, but that's incredibly gross in terms of categorization. People are going to be up and down on their journey depending on other things that are happening in their lives. They're making decisions about finance, about life, about their own mortality. And then we're coming in with issues about trying to support their communication, which we know is incredibly important. I suppose that's what gives me the confidence to say that whatever is going on inside someone's life, there's always going to be a need for communication. And that's why I think speech therapists particularly are integral in the management of MND, because they are the professionals there to support and enable people with communication. And so it's up to us to devise those frameworks. I think AAC, as I said, is incredibly important, but it's not just about referring people and prescribing AAC. That's one important thing. But giving someone a device, that's not therapy. That's just prescribing. And the work comes with when someone's got their AAC device and they need to learn how it's going to integrate into their lives. That's the therapy coming back again.
Fantastic. So Lynn would like to know, how does one detect the beginning of changes in cognition? And we wonder, does that impact on the things that you've been talking about tonight? Do you notice changes in those interactions?
I think this needs a huge amount more research. So many clinicians will be familiar with the Edinburgh Cognitive Scale, which is a screening tool which any professional can use. So that would be the kind of go-to early stage cognition screening tool. But, I think cognition is a very slippery fish, because it's not just about looking inside someone's head, it's looking at their behavior at the same time. And it's rather like speech. You can't easily measure speech because there are so many interrelated variables at respiratory, phonatory, resonance, articulation lines, that you've got this kind of combination of features, including cognition, and then compensatory strategies that people bring in. So getting to the pure heart of cognition is one thing, but seeing how it manifests as a clinical symptom is another. And I think there's a lot of subclinical cognitive issues at play here. If you assess someone for cognition, chances are you're going to find a problem. If you assess me now, you're going to find problems. I guarantee it. But does that mean it's impacting me on a day-to-day basis? Possibly. But am I able to function in the way I want to, irrespective of those changes, is another issue. So we're really playing around here with the concept of what matters and to whom. So it's an issue of validity. I'm not an expert in cognition. I wish I had more awareness of cognition. And that's where I think we probably need a little bit more investigation into the relationship between language, cognition, and speech, rather than separate identities. So language and cognition are often kind of put together, and then speech is seen as this kind of motor thing. But actually, it's the interplay between all three that might be our key. But I'd also reference work by Anna Volkmar at the moment. She's got a lovely NIHR award looking at progressive primary aphasia, and also work by Suzanne and others on the Voice Project up in Nottingham on dementia, and thinking through what does it mean to see cognitive change in reality, in conversation. I know there was a great group meeting of minds last week up at Loughborough where dementia was the theme, and there were lots of different researchers coming in to talk about dementia. We shouldn't just see dementia as a separate thing. There are clearly things that we can learn there that we can apply to MND too. So there's a little bit more information gathering, maybe some review work on what's out there, and then asking the right questions for future research. I'm really good at responding to questions without giving the answer people want. I'm very aware of that.
Wonderful. Well, I think we are approaching the end of our session now. And I think my question would be, how do you keep your energy up and your enthusiasm? It's been so wonderful to hear, when you wander off. I love that kind of thing, because it really kind of shows the holistic view you have of this subject, and you really centre the human beings at the middle of all this. So it's been an absolute delight to listen to your talk tonight, Stephen. Congratulations. I think everyone's really got a lot out of it. As you say, we'll make sure that the resources are available for people, and we will make sure people are aware of how to access those. Again, I'd like to thank everyone involved in tonight's talk. First and foremost, Stephen, for his enthusiasm, his knowledge, his compassion that came through really well in the talk. And I'd like to thank everyone who's registered and attended this evening. It's so wonderful to see both speech and language therapists and people from the multidisciplinary team all interested in the communication and having better conversations with people with MND. A big thank you to the MND Association and to the Stephen Hawking for funding this evening. And really, thank you so much for all the questions which have stimulated so much conversation after Stephen's talk. So from me and from the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists, a very good evening. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have done. Thank you so much for coming tonight. And thanks again, Stephen. Say good night, Stephen.
Everyone, thanks, and thank you, Sean. That's very kind of you. And I will say again, thank you to Joe and your family for enabling us to make this come alive. And thanks to everyone for attending today, and maybe watching this on catch up at some point. I am so grateful for everything that the whole community around MND. It's very special. It's a devastating disease, and it's so important that we all work together and support each other, because it's not an easy thing. And I recognise that for all the joking, it's still an incredibly serious disease process that demands attention and good thinkers. So thank you, everyone.
Excellent. Thank you, and good night, everyone.